The name of this story is called The Weeping Giant. On December 26th, 2004, in the Indian Ocean, a 9.0 earthquake hit on Boxing Day. And it spread devastation all across the whole region, the whole Indian Ocean region, the whole Southeast Asian region. There were over 250,000 people killed during that event, and that's just an estimate. There were so much loss, so much sadness, so much bad times that happened during that event. But there were a few stories of remarkable heroism and survival, and this is one of them. This is the story of the Weeping Giant. My friend Gene is a world traveler. He's traveled all over the place. He loves to travel. From country to country, place that he goes, he enjoys himself. Now, he's only about 5'10", he's got a beard, stocky, but, decent built. And he was at a Sri Lankan resort, enjoying himself, beautiful summer sun. Well, summer for them, winter for us in December. But the beautiful weather, and it was all set out. And he was at a resort in Sri Lanka, just off the beach. And while he was sitting there and relaxing, he heard the thunder, the first waves as they came in and they hit Sri Lanka. And he saw the water rushing up off the beach and over, and it started blanketing across the entire base of the resort hotel. Now, the other tourists there didn't know what the heck it was. They just recognized that there was a lot of water coming in. Some of the natives, on the other hand, already had a good idea. Now, a tsunami wave, roughly 600 miles across and 50 feet high, was barreling over towards them. This was just the first wave, and the splash just did a little bit of damage. The natives ran. The tourists, most of them, stayed. The second wave came in. That's the one that took out the rest of the buildings and took out the cars and everything else, and Gene, and sent him flying through the water, tumbling, sucking down air, sucking down water, desperately trying to cling and bring himself back up above. And as he went and tumbled, he was nearly rendered unconscious when he slammed solidly into a wall. But it wasn't just a wall that he was hitting. It was the wall and the top of a small building. That was how high the water was at this point. He didn't recognize the person standing above him. It was another tourist. He couldn't tell, honestly, as he related the story to me, whether it was a German tourist or a Dutch tourist. Just had one of those kinds of accents. And this man helped pull him up. And although he had bruised or possibly broken ribs, he managed to get himself up. And on that roof, they were abutting what is a small cliff face over there off the coast in Sri Lanka. And it's one of the few areas where a building was close enough to it. The natives were busy trying to scramble up the small cliff face to get up above and get into higher ground onto a more level plateau where they could get out of the water. Gene was too busy trying to get himself air back in his lungs, and he couldn't really understand the tourist who was trying to explain to him what they were doing, but this man was now helping his family up and over to get over there. There was about another 25 people on the roof with them, and the water was continuing to rise to cover the building, and the building was starting to shake. Gene came up, and although he was injured, he helped some of the smaller natives to get up. And while he was listening and trying to climb up himself, he heard the sound of a woman yelling behind him. And when he looked, there was another woman, and even at this point it was hard to tell, but she was barely hanging on just off the edge of the roof to a piece of wood tree branch, and she was holding on, just with one arm. And he stretched out as far as he could, and he locked eyes with her, and he's trying to get her to reach her other arm out, but she couldn't and didn't. And as he watched, and he stretched his own hand out, he watched her pulled out from past him and into the water, and he watched her go under. With tears in his eyes, he did the only thing he could do, which is climb up. He reached out and climbed back down and helped some of the other smaller natives. One after another, he picked them up and pushed till he could get them up onto the cliff. The last two were two grandmothers, two elderly women who spoke no English, and all they were doing is yelling and screaming. And he looked at them, and he patted their faces, and he picked them up one at a time and pushed to have one of the other people hold them or pull them up, and they still couldn't reach. So he stood and dug his bare feet into the rocks, pulled himself a little higher, and pushed with one hand to get one of the little grandmothers up, where two men who stayed behind managed to pull her out. He took the second little grandmother and had to do the same thing. And he climbed and he pushed her up with one hand to get her onto the cliff into safety. And then he himself climbed up as he watched the rest of the people running further inland. And he looked back out as the entire rest of the building was swept out and swept away from underneath him. With tears in his eyes, he stood there watching. And the two grandmothers kept pawing at his face and kissing his hands. They kept stroking his beard. And he kind of shepherded them off to follow everyone else as they walked further down. Where they would walk was along a trail, which would come out further at the end. It wound up becoming a refugee camp, because that's not the story. A week later, Gene was back in the States, and he lived his life. 2 years later, though, he went back to Sri Lanka. For 2 years, he had the vision of this one woman in his mind. He kept remembering seeing her and her face as she was swept away. And he wanted to do something for himself, something cathartic, just to go and see the area again. And when he landed in Sri Lanka, went back to the same resort, stayed there as well. And like many places that had money, you wouldn't know any damage was there. They cleaned up and fixed everything. Buildings rebuilt, everything redone. But he got to see where he was and where he went. He followed the same walkway and could look and see the cliff face. There's no longer a building there, but he knew that's where he was. That's how he got up. Throughout Sri Lanka, and even today you'll find them, there are small shrines that are put out. There are pictures, photographs of people, there are flowers, there are handwritten notes left there. And Gene wanted to come to see if he could find the face of the woman that had left behind. As he looked, there were many tourists, there were typical tourists, they were photographing the shrines. There were the natives that are coming, leaving food, flowers, other offerings in memory. But he didn't see her face anywhere. So he kept walking along. He actually reached the old little refugee camp he had stayed at. And that now is a little mini shrine. But now that he had his bearings, he said, all right, I'm going to go back the walkway. So he backtracked, came back along the edge of the cliff, and saw where he originally had climbed up with all those other people. And there was another makeshift shrine that had been obviously regularly visited with flowers, some candles, offerings of food. There were some photographs, but not the photograph of the woman that he was looking for. But then he saw something that did surprise him, something he wasn't expecting to see. And that was his own face in a drawing, a caricature, on a poster. But it was written in Tamil, which is the native language in Sri Lanka. So he couldn't understand it. So he asked, is there someone that can translate this for me? I want to see what this is. It depicted a large bearded man, a giant, picking up people and putting them on the cliff. He met this woman, Leah. And Leah explained to him what the name of this poster, it's called The Weeping Giant. And he asked, where does this come from? He said, well, there are two elderly sisters, who they maintained the shrine, and they had this drawing for him. So, Jean asked, can he meet these sisters? And they said, well, they live not far. They come every day to the shrine. So Leah wouldn't take him to them, but she said she would bring them back. So as he sat, he watched. He looked at the now dry valley below him. He could see the beach from where he was. He saw the people, the tourists coming by, taking photographs. He watched the natives come, look, pay their respects, and move on. And as he sat, he thought about where he had come from and everything that had happened. He thought about the woman that he didn't save. But this reminder, the shrine in front of him, showed him those that he did. As he was sitting there, he saw the two grandmothers, apparently two sisters, slowly making their way arm in arm with Leah as she was escorting them, followed by a whole group of children around them who were hooting and hollering and jumping and all excited. And as they got closer, the two women came up and they gave blessings to Jean and kissed his hands, and they stroked his beard again. They reached up and stroked his beard. And he asked through Leah if she could interpret what this means. What was it that she drew? Why did they have this there? And through Leah, the women explained that they told people the story of this weeping giant who came from the west. And as the story is written out, there was once a weeping giant who was angry and sad. He lived in the lands of the west. And when he was angry, he would stamp his feet and would cause the ground to shake. And when he was sad, he would weep great tears. And one time he wept such great tears that they flooded across the land and drowned the people. But because he was not an evil giant, and he saw what he had done, the giant returned and came from the west. And he saved the people, and he picked them up from the water and saved them. And the giant still wept because he could not save all the people. The giant promised to return one day from the west if the land should ever flood again. And this is their story of the weeping giant that they told to anyone who would listen. But what happened was it was more than anyone who would listen, who were the children around them. It became a story that the children's parents remembered hearing this story as they were children. And they know the story. Oh yes, I remember hearing that story of the weeping giant from the west who came and saved the people. And their grandparents said, oh yes, I remember the story of the weeping giant. So although this fairy tale took place from what he did, if you go to Sri Lanka, you will see in places little posters. And if you ask if people know the story of the weeping giant, they will tell you, oh yes, I've always known the story of the weeping giant. The weeping giant who came from the west, who saved the people. And this has taken on its own modern mythology and lives in Sri Lanka today.